The buzzards were already circling when Jebediah found him, slumped against a sun-baked boulder. The creek bed, usually a ribbon of life, was just a scar on the land choked with dust. Jebediah nudged the man with his boot. No response, just the rattle of breath in his chest, thin as a spider's silk. He wasn't more than 30, face gaunt, clothes ragged. Jebediah knelt, pulled back a parched eyelid. Nothing there but the dull gleam of death. In the man's clenched fist, a crumpled piece of power. Jebediah pried it loose. A deed. Dust Devil's claim, it read, granting ownership of a spread not 20 miles south, nestled in the foothills. And a letter, addressed to a Stacy awaiting arrival. Jebediah scanned the words, the ink blurred by sweat and grime. A mail-order bride. The drought had been unforgiving. Jebediah's own well had run dry weeks ago. His cattle, what was left of them, were bony shadows. He'd been wandering for days, searching for water, any sign of hope. Dust Devil's claim. The name itself was a cruel joke, a promise broken by the relentless sun. He looked at the dying man, then back at the DUAs. The vultures circled lower, impassive. Cardet. He pictured her, fresh off the train, clutching a worn valise, her eyes wide with hope, expecting a husband, a wom, expecting life. Jebediah felt a familiar ache in his gut. Guilt, sharp and unwelcome. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wished this man dead. But the land was everything. It was survival. The man coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Jebediah flinched. Water, the man rasped, his voice a dry whisper. Jebediah looked around. Nothing. Not a drop. He pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the sun, from the man's dying gaze. He could ride to Dust Devil's claim, find the well, maybe even intercept Sarah at the train depot. Tell her what? That her husband was dead? That he, Jebediah, was taking his place? The thought tasted like ash in his mouth. He took the deed, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The weight of it felt heavy, like a steel. The man's breathing grew shallower. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He mumbled something, unintelligible. Then nothing. Jebediah stood. The sun beat down relentless. The vultures landed, their shadows long and menacing. He turned his horse south, towards Dust Devil's claim. He left the letter addressed to Sarah, lying beside the dead man. The wind picked it up, swirling it into the dust, erasing the hope written on its fragile poeses. The West took what it wanted. And Jebediah, he was just trying to survive. Jebediah spurred his horse toward Spruce Creek, a scattering of buildings huddled against the unforgiving mountainside, like frightened sheep. The Dust Devils danced around him, mocking his stolen claim, his stolen identity. Each gust seemed to whisper the dead man's name, Caleb. He reached the town, the rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves a stark contrast to the silence that had been his companion for days. Spruce Creek was a place of fleeting respite, a haven for weary travelers and those seeking fortune, or simply escape. The air hung thick with the scent of wood smoke, stale beer, and the ever-present dust. Jebediah dismounted in front of the telegraph office, a small, unassuming building that held the power to connect, and in his case, to deceive. He stepped inside, the interior cool and dim after the sun-scorched landscape. A young woman, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, looked up from her work. "Help you, mister?" she asked, her voice flat. "Telegram," Jebediah said, his voice rough from disuse. He cleared his throat. "To be sent to Chicago." He hesitated, the lie sticking in his throat. "To Prissy. Tell her Caleb is eagerly awaiting her arrival. Train station, Spruce Creek." He pushed a few coins across the counter, the metal cold against his palm. The woman counted them, her gaze unwavering. Jebediah felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone devoid of judgment. "No," Jebediah said, turning away. "That'll be all." He stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the weight of the telegram pressing down on him. He had sealed his fate, committed to this charade. The knot in his stomach tightened, a cold ball of unease. This lie was a dangerous game, one he wasn't sure he knew how to play. He walked towards the saloon, the sound of piano music and clinking glasses spilling out into the street. He needed a drink, something to wash away the dust and the guilt. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the murmur of conversations. Men sat around tables playing cards, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed. Others leaned against the bar, nursing their drinks, their gazes lost in the amber liquid. Jebediah found a spot at the bar, the worn wood cool beneath his fingertips. He signaled the bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache and a weary expression. "Whiskey," Jebediah said, his voice barely a whisper. The bartender poured him a shot, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. Jebediah tossed it back, the burning sensation momentarily eclipsing the turmoil in his mind. He ordered another and another, the whiskey numbing the edges of his conscience. The piano player pounded out a mournful tune, a ballad of lost love and broken dreams. Jebediah closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He saw Sarah's face in his mind's eye, a face he had only imagined from the dead man's letter. He pictured her arriving at the train station, her eyes filled with hope, only to find what? A stranger? A liar? He opened his eyes, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. He had traded one kind of desperation for another, exchanging the threat of starvation for the burden of deceit. The whiskey offered only a temporary escape, a fleeting illusion of peace. He knew deep down that the reckoning was coming, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the mountains, announcing the arrival of the iron horse. Jebediah stood across the street from the depot, hidden in the shadows of the general store, his hat pulled low. His stomach churned with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He'd pictured her a certain way, small, timid, grateful. Someone easily molded to his will, to his lie. Someone desperate enough to overlook the harsh realities of a dust devil's claim. The train screeched to a halt, steam hissing from its metal belly. The doors clanged open, and passengers began to disembark, a motley collection of travelers, owlsmen, and dreamers. Jebediah scanned the faces, searching for the woman he expected, the woman he had conjured in his mind. And then he saw her. She wasn't frail. She wasn't timid. She was magnificent. A woman of robust curves and fiery red hair piled high atop her head. Her dress, though travel-worn, was a vibrant shade of blue that seemed to defy the dusty landscape. She carried a sturdy valise in one hand and a parasol in the other, her chin held high, her eyes scanning the crowd with an air of unwavering confidence. This was Sarah. Jebediah swallowed hard. This was not the woman he had prepared for. This was not the woman he could easily deceive. The townsfolk of Spruce Creek, a collection of weathered faces accustomed to hardship and disappointment, stared openly. Sarah, a splash of unexpected color in their monochrome world, drew their gazes like a moth to a flame. Whispers rippled through the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and speculation. Jebediah remained hidden in the shadows, paralyzed by a wave of conflicting emotions. Surprise, fear, and despite himself, a flicker of something akin to admiration. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the dusty street, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby mountains. The moment stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken words. Sarah stood alone, a beacon of hope in a landscape of despair. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the onlookers, searching. Jebediah knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was looking for him, for Caleb. He took a step forward, then hesitated. The lie felt heavier now, the burden of his deception almost unbearable. He could turn back, disappear into the shadows, and let her discover the truth on her own. Let her face the harsh reality of Dust Devil's claim without his interference. But something held him back. A sense of obligation? Guilt? Or perhaps a sliver of hope that this woman, this vibrant, unexpected Sarah, could somehow redeem him. He took another step, emerging from the shadows, his free face still partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He knew he couldn't hide any longer. The time for lies was over. Or perhaps it was just beginning. He stepped fully into the light. Sarah's gaze locked onto his, her expression unreadable. She studied him. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, taking in every detail. The weathered face, the worn clothes, the hesitant posture. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Sarah?" he managed, his voice rough. A flicker of something, disappointment, crossed her face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She offered a small, polite smile. "Caleb? You're different than I pictured." Jebediah winced inwardly. Different. That was one word for it. "The journey was hard on me," he said, offering the first excuse that came to mind. "Welcome to Spruce Creek. Welcome home." He picked up her valise, the leather surprisingly heavy. He led her towards a dilapidated buckboard, hitched to a sway-backed mule. The ride to Dust Devil's claim was silent, punctuated only by the creaking of the wagon and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. Sarah took in the landscape, her gaze unwavering. Jebediah could feel her assessing everything, judging. The claim itself was worse than he remembered. The house was a ramshackle affair, its roof sagging, its walls scarred by years of sun and wind. The barn was little more than a skeletal frame, its timbers rotting. The well, the lifeblood of the place, was capped with a rusty lid a sullen testament to the ongoing drought. Sarah stepped down from the wagon, her blue dress a stark contrast to the drab surroundings. She surveyed the scene, her expression unchanging. Jebediah braced himself for her reaction, for the inevitable disappointment. "Well," she said finally, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's rustic." He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He led her inside the cabin, the interior even more depressing than the exterior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracks in the walls. The furniture was sparse and worn, consisting of a rickety table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a bed that looked as though it would collapse at the slightest touch. That night, it did. Sarah had just settled onto the edge of the bed, weary from her journey, when the timbers groaned, the frame buckled, and she found herself unceremoniously deposited on the floor. The crash echoed through the small cabin, startling Jebediah, who had been trying to start a fire in the hearth. He rushed over, his face a mask of concern. "Sarah, are you all right?" She sat up, brushing dust from her dress, a smile playing on her lips. "Perfectly fine," she said, her eyes sparkling with amusement, "though I dare say this bed has seen better days." Jebediah felt a surge of irritation. He had been dreading this moment. The moment when she would realize the full extent of his deception. The moment when her hope would turn to anger and resentment. But instead, she was laughing. He scowled. "It's old," he said lamely. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "No need," she said, standing up. "I've slept in worse. We can sleep on the floor tonight. Plenty of blankets, I presume." Jebediah stared at her, dumbfounded. He had expected tears, recriminations, a complete and utter breakdown. But Sarah was taking it all in stride, her spirit unbroken. He saw a strength in her laughter, a resilience that both intimidated and intrigued him. As they lay on the floor that night, wrapped in rough blankets, the creaking timbers of the old ranch house seemed to echo the precariousness of their situation. He was a liar, living a stolen life. She was a woman of unknown depths, forced to confront a reality far different from her dreams. The West was a harsh mistress, and they were both at her mercy. He wondered if either of them would survive. The following days bled into a rhythm of hard labor under the relentless sun. Jebediah expected Sarah to balk at the work, to complain about the dust and the heat and the endless chores. He expected her to retreat into bitterness and regret. But she didn't. She rose before dawn, helping him with the milking, her city-soft hands surprisingly adept at the task. She mended fences with a skill that belied her refined appearance, her needle flashing as she stitched the wire back together. She even took to tending the few scrawny chickens and the single stubborn pig with a surprising degree of affection. One afternoon, while Jebediah was struggling to clear a patch of overgrown weeds near the dilapidated barn, Ori emerged with a rifle slung over her shoulder. "Think I might try my hand at putting some meat on the table," she announced, her voice casual. "Anything in particular you'd like?" Jebediah scoffed. "You? Hunt?" He gestured to the vast, empty landscape. "There ain't much out here, and what is ain't gonna wait for a lady in a fancy dress to take aim." Sarah simply smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Don't underestimate a city girl, Caleb." She walked a short distance from the house, found a sturdy rock to rest against, and raised the rifle to her shoulder. Jebediah watched, skeptical, as she took aim at a distant jackrabbit. He'd been hunting these lands for months, and rarely had any luck. The rabbits were quick, the wind unpredictable, and his own aim, he admitted, was often unsteady. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley. The jackrabbit dropped. Jebediah stared, dumbfounded. He walked over to where Sarah stood, reloading the rifle with a practiced ease that suggested she was no stranger to firearms. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, trying to mask his surprise. "Perhaps," Sarah said, her smile widening. "Or perhaps I'm just a better shot than you are." She challenged him to a target practice competition. He accepted, reluctantly. She beat him handily, hitting tin cans at impossible distances with a calm precision that left him speechless. The days turned into weeks. The initial awkwardness between them began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding forged in shared labor and mutual respect. Jebediah found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a growing admiration. She was strong, resilient, and resourceful. She was also beautiful, not in a delicate, fragile way, but with a raw, earthy beauty that mirrored the unforgiving landscape around them. He still carried the weight of his lie, the knowledge that he was living a stolen life. But as he watched Sarah work, as he saw her face light up with a genuine smile, a flicker of hope began to ignite within him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could find redemption in this harsh, unforgiving land. Perhaps he could earn her forgiveness, and maybe, just maybe, even her love. The vast open landscape stretched out before them, a silent witness to their shared labor, their growing connection, and the secrets that still lay buried beneath the surface. The West held its breath, waiting to see what fate had in store for them. The sun beat down on the parched earth, making the dust into a fine powder that coated everything: the cabin, the fields, even their lungs. Jebediah wiped sweat from his brow, his gaze fixed on Sarah as she expertly repaired a section of the fence. He'd been meaning to ask her about her life back east, but the words always seemed to catch in his throat, choked by the guilt that festered within him. He'd assumed in his arrogance that she was running from something. A broken heart, perhaps, or a desperate situation that had forced her to seek refuge in the lonely embrace of the West. He'd pictured her as a blank slate, easily molded to his fabricated reality. But Sarah was anything but. The truth, when it finally came, arrived unexpectedly. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the cool evening air offering a brief respite from the day's heat. Sarah was humming a tune, a melody that sounded faintly familiar, but that he couldn't quite place. "What's that you're humming?" he asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. Sarah smiled. "Just an old school song. I used to teach back in Boston, you know." The words hit him like a physical blow. Teacher, Boston. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture far different from the one he'd conjured in his mind. "You were a teacher?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Yes. For 5 years. I taught history, literature, a bit of geography. I enjoyed it, mostly." "Then why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Why would a woman like her, a woman with education and opportunity, choose this? This desolate patch of land, this life of hardship and uncertainty? Sarah sighed, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. "I needed a change," she said, her voice soft. "Life in Boston, it was too complicated. Too many expectations, too many obligations." She paused as if searching for the right words. "I saw Caleb's advertisement in the paper. He promised a simple life, a chance to start over. That's what I was looking for, simplicity." Jebediah felt the weight of his deception crushing him. He hadn't just lied about his identity. He'd stolen a dream. He'd lured her here under false pretenses, offering her a life that was anything but simple. He'd exploited her desire for a fresh start, twisting it into a cruel parody of what she'd hoped for. The prairie wind picked up, whispering through the tall grass, carrying secrets he could no longer ignore. He looked at Sarah, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond the physical exhaustion of the day's labor. He saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of the past that still haunted her. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess his sins and beg for her forgiveness. But the words remained trapped within him, held captive by fear and shame. He was afraid of losing her, of shattering the fragile bond that had formed between them. He was afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. Instead, he simply said, "It ain't much, this place. But we'll make it work. We'll build something together." He knew it was a hollow promise, a desperate attempt to cling to the illusion he had created. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw a glimmer of hope, a spark of belief that refused to be extinguished. And in that moment, he knew that he couldn't keep lying. The truth, like the relentless sun, would eventually come to light. He just hoped that when it did, it wouldn't destroy them both. Spruce Creek, little more than a scattering of ramshackle buildings clinging to the dusty earth, was having a social, a rare event, fueled by the recent, albeit meager, harvest and a desperate need for human connection in the vast emptiness. Jebediah had initially balked. Town gatherings were for folks with nothing to hide, for families and gossiping neighbors. He was neither. Sarah, however, seemed genuinely excited. She'd spent the afternoon carefully mending her blue dress, her fingers working with a practiced dexterity that both fascinated and unnerved him. The dress, a stark reminder of her former life, seemed out of place amidst the rough-hewn surroundings of Dust Devil's claim. He'd relented, grudgingly. The thought of Sarah alone, surrounded by prying eyes and whispered questions, was unbearable. He owed her that much at least. The makeshift dance floor was a cleared patch of ground in front of the general store, illuminated by flickering lanterns strung between the buildings. The air thrummed with the lively strains of a fiddle and banjo, the music a surprisingly joyous counterpoint to the harsh realities of their lives. People were laughing, talking, momentarily forgetting the drought, the loneliness, the ever-present threat of hardship. Jebediah stood on the edge of the crowd, a dark silhouette against the flickering light. He watched Sarah, her face radiant, as she chatted with some of the other women. He felt a pang of something akin to jealousy. He wanted to be the one to make her smile like that. He'd been a fool to think he could keep his secret forever. The truth was a festering wound, poisoning everything he touched. He knew he had to tell her, but the thought of facing her anger, her disappointment, was almost more than he could bear. The music shifted to a waltz, a slow, mournful tune that tugged at his heartstrings. He saw men approaching Sarah, offering their hands for a dance. She politely declined, her gaze scanning the crowd. Their eyes met. He hesitated then. Driven by an irresistible force, he walked towards her. "May I have this dance, Miss Sarah?" he asked, his voice rough. She looked surprised, but a slow smile spread across her face. "I thought you'd never ask, Caleb." He took her hand, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her soft skin. He led her onto the dance floor, his movements awkward and hesitant. He hadn't danced in years, not since before he became Jebediah, the liar. As they moved together, slowly circling the dance floor, the music seemed to envelop them, creating a small temporary world, separate from the harsh reality of the West. He could feel her body close to his, the warmth of her presence a balm to his troubled soul. He knew this was his chance. He had to tell her now, before the moment passed, before the music stopped and the illusion shattered. He took a deep breath. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely audible above the music. "There's something I need to tell you. Something about Caleb." He felt her stiffen in his arms, her eyes, usually so warm and inviting, turned cold and wary. "Caleb?" she repeated, her voice tight. "What about him?" He stopped dancing, pulling her gently to the edge of the dance floor. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with remorse. "I'm not Caleb," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My name is Jebediah. I lied to you. I'm so sorry." The shock on her face was palpable. Her eyes widened, her mouth forming a silent O. He could see the hurt, the betrayal, the dawning realization that everything she thought she knew was a lie. "What? What are you saying?" she stammered, her voice trembling. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I'll explain everything," he said. "Just, please, don't hate me." The fiddle music swelled, the sound suddenly mocking and cruel. Their connection, so fragile, hung precariously in the balance. The West held its breath, waiting to see if this small act of honesty would bring them closer together, or tear them apart forever. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the mournful wail of the fiddle. Jebediah braced himself, expecting a torrent of anger, accusations, perhaps even tears. He deserved it all. Instead, Sarah's expression slowly morphed from shock to something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't the blind rage he had anticipated either. You're not Caleb," she repeated, the words devoid of emotion. "Then, what happened to him?" He swallowed hard, the taste of dust and regret bitter on his tongue. He died. A fever took him a few weeks before you arrived. I buried him myself." He watched her closely, searching for any sign of grief, any indication that she had truly cared for the man she'd never met. But her face remained impassive, almost de-eyed. "And you just took his place?" she asked, her voice flaky. He nodded, shame burning in his gut. "I did. I know it was wrong. I was desperate. I needed the light." Sarah turned away, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The music had stopped, leaving an unsettling quiet in its way. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on them, their whispers like the rustling of snakes in the grass. Then she said something that shattered his expectations, something that turned everything he thought he knew about her on its head. "I already knew," she said, her voice barely audible. Jebediah stared at her, dumbfounded. "Knew? Knew what?" "That Caleb was likely dead," she clarified, turning back to face him. "I received a letter from a lawyer a few weeks before I left Boston. He detailed Caleb's failing health, his weakened state. He suggested I might want to reconsider my puns." The air left Jebediah's lungs in a rush. He felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet, leaving him teetering on the edge of an abyss. "But white youth, why didn't you say anything?" Sarah shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about her resilience, her pragmatism. "What would have been the point? I didn't come for Caleb. Not really. I came for the land." She gestured to the sprawling expanse of Dust Devil's claim, the fields, the dilapidated cabin, the endless horizon. This is what I wanted, a chance to build something from the ashes, a chance to prove myself." He stared at her, seeing her in a completely new light. He had underestimated her, judged her based on her refined appearance, her Eastern upbringing. He had assumed she was seeking a refuge, a safe haven. He hadn't realized that she was a fighter, a survivor, just like him. "You knew he was dying and you still came?" he asked, incredulous. "I came for the opportunity," she said, her eyes hardening. "And you, Jebediah, you were simply a means to an end." He flinched at the honesty in her words, the cold calculation in her gaze. He had deceived her, yes, but she had been equally deceptive, playing a game of her own. Above them, a hawk circled, its keen eyes scanning the landscape below. It seemed to mirror their shifting dynamic, their uneasy alliance, their shared desire for survival in this harsh and unforgiving land. The West, as always, watched and waited. The revelation hung in the air, sharper than a winter wind. Jebediah felt the weight of Sarah's words, each syllable a stone added to the burden he already carried. He'd thought he was the only one playing a part, but she'd been acting all along, her motives hidden beneath a veneer of quiet acceptance. Before he could fully process the implications of her confession, a new shadow fell across Spruce Creek. A cloud of dust billowed on the horizon, growing larger with alarming speed. The townsfolk, already on edge, stirred with a nervous energy, their whispers escalating into anxious murmurs. Jebediah's hand instinctively moved to the worn handle of his revolver. He knew that dust cloud. It meant trouble, the kind that came with iron and ill intent. "Claim jumpers," he muttered, his voice low and grim. Sarah followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the approaching threat. "Claim jumpers? What are you talking about?" "Barlow's gang," Jebediah explained, his jaw tight. "They've been working their way through the territory, forcing folks off their land, stealing claims." A wave of fear washed over Sarah's face, momentarily erasing the cool detachment she'd displayed only moments before. The reality of their situation, the precariousness of their hold on this land, suddenly crashed down upon her. "But we have a legal claim," she protested, her voice trembling. "Caleb filed all the paperwork." Jebediah snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. "Paperwork ain't worth spit when you're staring down the barrel of a gun. Barlow and his boys don't care about the law." He watched as the riders crested the hill, their silhouettes stark against the setting sun. There were at least a dozen of them, each armed to the teeth and radiating an aura of menace. Leading the pack was a burly figure on a black stallion, his face hidden beneath the brim of a white-brimmed hat. Jebediah knew that face. It belonged to Barlow, a man with a reputation for cruelty and a thirst for land. The riders thundered into Spruce Creek, scattering the remaining townsfolk like chickens. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of dread. Barlow reined in his horse in front of the general store, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory gleam. Well, he drawled, his voice a gravelly rasp. What have we here? Looks like Spruce Creek's having a party. Too bad it's about to be cut short. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, like a coiled snake ready to strike. Two of his men followed suit, flanking him like loyal hounds. We're just having a social, Mr. Barlow, the storekeeper stammered, his voice barely audible. We ain't looking for no trouble. Barlow chuckled, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Jebediah's spine. Trouble. I ain't looking for trouble either, friend. I'm just here to offer some assistance. Seems some folks around here are having a hard time making ends meet. We're here to help them lighten their load. His gaze swept over the crowd, landing on Jebediah and Sarah. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he recognized them. Well now, he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. If it ain't the happy couple from Dust Devil's Claim. Heard you folks been having some trouble with the well. Figured we'd stop by and offer our condolences, and maybe a little advice. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on Sarah. This land ain't for the faint of heart, ma'am. Sometimes the best thing a body can do is just move on. Save yourself a whole lot of grief. Jebediah stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and Barlow. We ain't moving on, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gut. This is our land. We worked for it. Barlow laughed, a loud, mocking sound that echoed through the town. Worked for it? You call scratching in the dirt working? This land is too good for the likes of you. It belongs to someone who can actually make something of it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I got a buyer willing to pay top dollar for this claim. You two can pack your bags and be gone by sunrise. Otherwise, he let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but clear. The dry wind carried the scent of impending violence. Barlow's eyes narrowed, the smile vanishing like smoke in the wind. Otherwise, he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, things are gonna get real unpleasant. Real fast. He gestured to his men, who shifted menacingly, their hands resting on the butts of their revolvers. Jebediah didn't flinch. He'd faced down worse odds before. He knew Barlow, knew his kind. They thrived on fear, on intimidation. Show them a crack, and they'd exploit it. He met Barlow's gaze, his own unwavering. We ain't scared of you, Barlow, he said, the words laced with steel. This is our home. And we're staying. A flicker of surprise crossed Barlow's face. He hadn't expected resistance. He'd figured they'd fold, like so many others. But something in Jebediah's eyes, something resolute and unyielding, gave him pause. He glanced at Sarah, who stood beside Jebediah, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. He saw a strength in her he hadn't anticipated. He'd pegged her for a city girl, soft and easily broken. He'd been wrong. All right, Barlow said, his voice regaining its oily smoothness. Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you. He spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. We'll be back. And next time, we won't be so polite. He turned and remounted his horse, his men following suit. They rode out of Spruce Creek, leaving a trail of dust and fear in their wake. The townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale and shaken. They cast wary glances at Jebediah and Sarah, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. As the last of the riders disappeared over the horizon, Jebediah turned to Sarah. We need to get back to the claim, he said, his voice urgent. Now. Sarah nodded, her earlier fear replaced by a grim determination. What are we going to do? We're going to fight, Jebediah said, his jaw tight. We're going to defend what's ours. They rode back to Dust Devil's Claim in silence, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the land. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the promise of violence. Jebediah knew that Barlow wouldn't back down. He'd be back, sooner rather than later. And when he came, he'd be coming to take what he wanted, by any means necessary. As they reached the ranch, Jebediah surveyed their meager defense. The cabin was dilapidated, the barn was falling apart, and the only fence was a rickety structure that wouldn't stop a determined jackrabbit. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "We need to fortify this place," he said, his mind already racing. "Board up the windows, reinforce the doors. We need to make it as difficult as possible for them to get inside." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a hammer and a stack of planks and began boarding up the windows of the cabin. Her movements, surprisingly efficient. Jebediah worked alongside her, his hands moving with practiced speed. They worked in silence, their shared purpose forging a new bond between them. As darkness fell, they retreated inside the cabin, their faces grimy, their bodies aching. They ate a meager meal of beans and hardtack, their conversation sparse and practical. "How many bullets do we have, Sarah?" Sarah asked. Jebediah counted the cartridges in his gun belt. "Not enough," he said grimly. "We need to ration them. Every shot has to count." They spent the rest of the night preparing for the siege, sharpening knives, cleaning their weapons, and discussing their strategies. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But they also knew that they had something Barlow didn't. A reason to fight. This land wasn't just a piece of dirt to them. It was a symbol of hope, a chance for a new beginning. And they weren't about to give it up without a fight. Outside, the wind howled, whipping across the plains like a restless spirit. The darkening sky rumbled with thunder, foreshadowing the coming storm. Jebediah looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the flickering lamplight. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a quiet courage, a steely resolve. He knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The first shots rang out just before dawn, shattering the fragile peace. A volley of bullets slammed into the cabin, splintering wood and sending dust raining down from the ceiling. Jebediah grabbed his rifle, his movements swift and practiced. Sarah crouched beside him, her own revolver clutched tightly in her hand. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. "Stay low," Jebediah instructed, peering through a crack in the boarded-up window. He saw Barlow and his men surrounding the cabin, their face grim and determined. The attack had begun. He fired back, aiming carefully, squeezing the trigger with deliberate precision. One of Barlow's men cried out and fell to the ground, clutching his arm. The other riders scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees. The gunfight intensified, a furious exchange of lead and fury. Bullets whizzed past their heads, tearing through the cabin walls. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Jebediah and Sarah fought back to back, their movements coordinated, their trust absolute. They covered each other's blind spots, calling out warnings, anticipating each other's needs. "They're trying to flank us," Sarah shouted, firing a shot towards the back of the cabin. Jebediah spun around, leveling his rifle. He saw two of Barlow's men creeping towards the barn, their intentions clear. He feared, hitting one in the leg. The other man retreated, dragging his wounded comrade behind him. The siege dragged on, each minute an eternity. Jebediah and Sarah were running low on ammunition. The cabin was taking a beating, the walls riddled with bullet holes. They knew they couldn't hold out forever. "We need to do something," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." Jebediah nodded, his mind racing. He needed a plan, a way to turn the tide. He glanced at the back door, a risky escape route. "I have an idea," he said, his voice low. "But it's dangerous. You ready?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I was born ready." Jebediah grabbed a kerosene lamp and a box of matches. "We're going to create a diversion," he explained. I'll set fire to the barn. It'll draw their attention, give us a chance to slip out the back and make a run for it." Sarah nodded, understanding the plan. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. Jebediah crept to the back door, peering out cautiously. The coast seemed clear. He took a deep breath and threw open the door, sprinting towards the barn. He splashed kerosene on the hay bales and lit a match. The flames erupted, quickly engulfing the barn in a roaring inferno. He turned back to the cabin, signaling to Sarah. She emerged from the back door, her revolver drawn, ready to fight. The fire had worked. Barlow and his men were distracted, their attention focused on the burning barn. Jebediah and Sarah seized the opportunity, running towards the cover of the nearby trees. But Barlow wasn't fooled for long. He spotted them fleeing and let out a roar of rage. "Get them!" he bellowed, urging his men forward. The chase was on. Jebediah and Sarah ran for their lives, dodging bullets, weaving through the trees. They knew that if they were caught, they would face a brutal end. But they refused to give up. They would fight to the bitter end, defending their claim, their home, their future. The land was soaked in blood, the smell of fire filling their nostrils. They knew that their fate and the fate of Dust Devil's claim hung precariously in the balance. The thundering hooves grew closer, bullets sniffing past them like angry wasps. Jebediah risked a glance over his shoulder. Barlow and two of his men were gaining ground, their faces contorted with bloodlust. Sarah stumbled, catching herself on a gnarled tree root. "Keep going," Jebediah yelled, pulling her forward. They reached the edge of the forest, the open plains stretching before them. Their horses were tethered some distance away, their only hope of escape. Just as they broke free of the tree line, a shot rang out. Jebediah felt a searing pain in his shoulder, the impact knocking him off balance. He went down hard, the wind knocked out of him. Sarah screamed, turning back to help him. "Jebediah!" He pushed her away. "Go! Get the horses!" She hesitated, her face etched with worry. "I'm not leaving you. I'll be right behind you. Just go," he urged, knowing they didn't have a second to spare. Reluctantly, she turned and ran, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Jebediah scrambled to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. He knew he couldn't outrun them in his condition. He had to buy Sarah some time. He ducked behind a large boulder, taking aim with his rifle. He squeezed the trigger, sending a bullet whistling towards Barlow. Barlow ducked, cursing under his breath. Jebediah fired again, forcing them to take cover. He managed to hold them off for a few precious minutes, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. He was running out of ammunition. His shoulder was throbbing, and Barlow was closing in. Just when he thought all hope was lost, he heard a familiar sound, the pounding of hooves. He looked up and saw Thrall riding back towards him, leading a second horse. "Get on!" she shouted, pulling up beside him. Jebediah didn't hesitate. He grabbed the reins and swung himself onto the horse, wincing in pain. They galloped away, leaving Barlow and his men in their dust. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits until they were sure they were out of reach. They finally slowed to a walk, their horses lathered in sweat. They found a secluded spot near a creek, dismounting to rest. Sarah tended to Jebediah's wound, cleaning it with water and bandaging it with a strip of cloth torn from her dress. "Thank you," Jebediah said, his voice hoarse. "You saved my life." "We saved each other," Sarah replied, her eyes filled with emotion. As they rested, Jebediah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Barlow had been too confident, too well informed. He knew their every move, anticipated their every action. It was as if he had someone on the inside. He scanned the landscape, suspicion gnawing at him. His gaze fell upon the distant silhouette of a figure on horseback, watching them from a ridge. It was Silas, one of the ranch hands who had been helping them defend the claim. Silas raised his hand in a mock salute, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Jebediah's blood ran cold. Silas, it all made sense now. The sabotaged well, the missing ammunition, the perfectly timed attacks. He'd trusted Silas, treated him like a brother. And all along, he'd been working with Barlow. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, the realization of Silas's treachery hitting him like a physical blow. The fire that had consumed the barn seemed to mirror the burning rage that now consumed him. He looked at Sarah, his heart heavy with guilt. He'd brought her into this mess of violence and deceit. And now, because of his misplaced trust, they were both in more danger than ever. The crackling campfire seemed to illuminate not only the darkness of the West, but the treacherous nature of men. Jebediah gripped his injured shoulder, the betrayal a sharper pain than the bullet wound. Silas, the snake he'd welcomed into their camp. He looked at Sarah, her face a mask of grim determination. He'd underestimated her, pegged her as a city woman, soft. He'd been a fool. Silas, he rasped, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He's been feeding Barlow information. Sarah's jaw tightened. We'll deal with him. Her voice was low, steady. She wasn't panicked, wasn't broken. She was calculating. He watched her, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't finished yet. What do you have in mind? She pointed towards a narrow canyon, the entrance hidden by a thicket of scrub brush. Remembers that old Comancheria trail? The one that cuts through Rattlesnake Canyon? Jebediah nodded. It was a treacherous path, riddled with loose rock and blind corners. A death trap for anyone who didn't know it well. Barlow will be expecting us to run, Sarah continued, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous intelligence. He'll think he has us cornered. Let's give him what he expects, then give him something he doesn't. Her plan was audacious, risky, but it was their only chance. They would use the canyon as a funnel, turning Barlow's aggression against him. Silas will lead them, Jebediah said, understanding dawning. He'll want to prove himself. Exactly. Sarah grabbed the reins of her horse. We'll set the stage. Make it look like we're fleeing into the canyon. Then we'll double back, cut them off. They rode towards the canyon, leaving a clear trail for Barlow to follow. Jebediah felt a surge of admiration for Sarah. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back, using her wits to even the odds. As they reached the canyon entrance, Sarah turned to him. Ready? He nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Let's give them hell. They plunged into the darkness of the canyon, the walls rising up around them like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sage. They rode for several miles, deeper and deeper into the winding passage. Then, at a prearranged point, they dismounted, tying their horses to a cluster of mesquite trees. Now we wait, Sarah whispered, crouching behind a rocky outcrop. The sun beat down on them, the silence spoken only by the rustling of lizards and the distant call of a hawk. Jebediah felt the tension building, the anticipation tightening his muscles. Finally, they heard it. The thunder of hooves, the jingle of spurs, the guttural voice of Barlow's men. They were coming. Criro squeezed his arm. Remember the plan? Jebediah nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He peeked over the rocks. Barlow and his men were riding into the canyon, Silas leading the way, a smug grin on his face. As they passed their hiding place, Sarah gave the signal. They sprang from their cover, straightening their revolvers. The shots echoed through the canyon, throwing Barlow's men into chaos. Silas's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror. He realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered. The fight was brutal, short, and decisive. Sarah, with a coolness that belied her background, picked off Barlow's men one by one, her shots precise and deadly. Jebediah, despite his wounded shoulder, fought with a ferocity born of betrayal and desperation. Within minutes, the canyon was silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the whinnying of horses. Barlow lay dead in the dust, a bullet hole between his eyes. Silas, his face pale and streaked with dirt, was slumped against a rock, his leg shattered. Sarah stood over him, her revolver pointed at his head. "Why, Silas? Why did you do it?" Silas looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "He promised me gold, promised me land." Sarah's expression hardened. "You sold us out for gold?" She spat on the ground near his feet. Jebediah watched Sarah as she stood there, a figure of quiet strength against the harsh landscape. He saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, a cold, unwavering justice. He knew then that Dust Devil's claim would be safe in her hands, perhaps safer than it ever would have been with him. She lowered the revolver, the click echoing in the sudden silence. "Get him on a horse." She didn't look at Jebediah as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the fallen Silas. "Take him to Fort Smith. Let the judge decide his fate." Jebediah frowned. "You're letting him live." The betrayal still stung, the desire for vengeance a raw ache in his gut. Sarah finally turned, her eyes meeting his. "Killing him won't bring back what we lost, Jebediah. It won't erase what he did. But justice might." He saw the logic in her words, the quiet wisdom that ran deeper than any frontier code. He holstered his own revolver, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than before. "All right," he conceded. "Let's get this over with." They managed to get Silas onto one of the horses, his groans of pain a constant reminder of his treachery. Jebediah tied his hands, ensuring he couldn't escape. The journey to Fort Smith would be long and arduous, but it was a journey Silas deserved. As they rode out of the canyon, leaving the carnage behind, the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The light illuminated the landscape, washing away the shadows of the night and revealing the harsh beauty of the west. Jebediah glanced at Sarah, her face etched with exhaustion, but also a newfound sense of purpose. She had faced death, betrayal, and hardship, and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever. He realized that she wasn't just fighting for Dust Devil's claim. She was fighting for something more. A future, a hope, a belief in the possibility of justice in a lawless land. The journey to Fort Smith was a silent one. Silas remained slumped in the saddle, his spirit broken. Jebediah and Sarah rode side by side, their thoughts unspoken, but their bond forged in the crucible of violence and shared survival. As they approached the town, Jebediah could see the outline of the fort in the distance, a symbol of law and order in a chaotic world. He knew that handing Silas over to the authorities wouldn't solve all their problems, but it was a start. It was a step towards building a better future, a future where justice prevailed over revenge. He looked at Sarah, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Dust Devil's claim is in good hands," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "We'll make it work, Jebediah. We'll make it work." The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow on the town, the fort, and the two riders who had chosen justice over vengeance. The West remained wild, untamed, and unforgiving, but in the heart of it all, a small act of mercy had taken root, a promise of hope in a land scarred by violence. The fate of Dust Devil's claim, and perhaps their own, remained unwritten, but they rode towards it together, their shoulders squared against the rising sun. Fort Smith faded behind them, but the weight of Silas's betrayal lingered like yeast on their clothes. Jebediah knew returning to Dust Devil's claim wouldn't be easy. The barn was gone, the well sabotaged, and the trust among the remaining hands shattered. But looking at Sarah, her jaw set with a quiet determination. He knew they couldn't just walk away. They'd spilled too much blood on that land. The ride back was slow, deliberate. They stopped at the general store in a small crossroads town, replenishing supplies and picking up tools. Jebediah noticed Sarah buying extra nails, a small practical act that spoke volumes about her intentions. As they neared the claim, the charred remains of the barn came into view, a stark reminder of their near-fatal deception. Jebediah felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had brought Sarah into this mess, lured her with a lie. He reined in his horse, stopping a few yards from the wreckage. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I lied to you, used you to save my claim. I understand it if you want to leave." Sarah dismounted, her boots crunching on the scorched earth. She walked towards him, her gaze unwavering. "We both lied, Jebediah. You to save your land, me to escape my past. We were both running. But out there, in that canyon, something changed." She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I'm not leaving, Jebediah. Not yet. We owe it to ourselves, to this land, to build something real, something honest." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even tears. But not this. This quiet resolve, this unwavering belief in their ability to overcome the past. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a city woman out of her element, but a survivor, a fighter, a woman forged in the fires of adversity. He saw a partner. "All right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's rebuild it." Together they spent the next few weeks working side by side, clearing the debris, repairing the well, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding the barn. The work was hard, backbreaking, but there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the claim slowly come back to life. They talked, too, about their pasts, about the lies they had told, about the reasons they had come to Dust Devil's claim. Jebediah confessed his desperation to hold on to his family's legacy, his fear of losing everything. Sarah spoke of her own troubled past, of the reasons she had fled the city, of her yearning for a fresh start. They didn't gloss over the ugly parts, didn't try to excuse their actions. They simply laid bare their souls, allowing the truth to seep into the cracks of their fractured relationship. One evening, as they sat by the campfire, the newly rebuilt barn silhouetted against the twilight sky, Sarah turned to Jebediah. "This land," she said, her voice soft, "it was built on a lie. But maybe we can make it something more." Jebediah nodded, his heart filled with a newfound hope. "Maybe," he said, "the richest soil grows from the seeds of a lie, watered by truth and hard work." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on their faces. The west remained wild, unforgiving. But in that small patch of land, a new future was taking root. A future forged not in deception, but in honesty, resilience, and the unexpected bond between a weathered cowboy and a city woman who had found her strength in the heart of the desert. Dust Devil's claim, once a symbol of their deceit, was slowly becoming a testament to their shared will to survive, and perhaps even to thrive.